Hi, this is Haley Gildersleeve for Professor Johnson's Profiling a Serial Offender class. We are doing our final project / presentation for the serial offender of our choice, and in this case I chose Edmund Emil Kemper III, or Ed Kemper as most say. Here's my student ID. There we go. Ed Kemper was known as Big Ed, the Santa Cruz Ogre, most notoriously as the Co-Ed Killer, the Santa Cruz Giant, and the Co-Ed Butcher. Edmund Kemp was from Santa Cruz, so he knew the area fairly well. Excuse me. He was born in 1948. We know all the nicknames that he went by. Big Ed, Santa Cruz Ogre, Santa Cruz Butcher, the Co-Ed Killer. He was born on December 18th of 1948 in Santa Cruz, California. So he grew up there. He knew the area fairly well before he started committing all these murders. The murders before, to talk about his childhood, he was from there, as I mentioned before. He grew up with a mother and two sisters. Father not really in his life, as most in these cases they aren't. His mother was very abusive, not only mentally, but physically. He was known for playing with his sisters and playing where he would decapitate heads off of these Barbie dolls, play gas chambers, play any kind of murderous, assaulting, just terrifying games with these things. His mother was so afraid that he would do something to his sisters that she would make him sleep in the basement all by himself and in the dark. That traumatized him at a young age, as most kids would be. She was so scared, and eventually he would blame her for all the things that he did. He hated his mother, and the killing sprees began in 1964 with his grandmother Maud. And in most cases, we see that these women are female, obviously, are white women, fair-skinned women, dark hair and dark eyes. The only male victim that we know of from him was his grandfather. Edmund Emil Kemp III. First. Next, he would go on to kill Mary Ann Pesks, and from there, Anita, and so on and so forth, with Kai Koo, Cindy Scholl, Rosalind Thrope, Alice Liu, and the most horrific out of all of them, of course they're all horrific, but his mother Clarnell. And most of these murders we see, they all have a pattern: strangulation, shooting, stabbing, decapitation, dismembering of the bodies, raping, necrophilia. But his mother was probably the worst out of all the victims, not because she was just like them, but it was his mother. She was only 52 when she died. She was sleeping, and he had had enough. So, that night, when she was in bed, he took a hammer that he found, and he just went off. He went right for the head, more on this side, because she was turned sleeping that way, the opposite of the window where he was standing in front of, and she died of blunt force trauma to the head, but that wasn't enough for him. He decapitated her head and her body. He kept that head as a souvenir. He would throw darts at it, but the worst of it all is he would commit acts of necrophilia with her head after he had dismembered it. And eventually, it would lead him to put her head outside of his bedroom window, looking up at him, because she would always say that he had to look up to her, but now she had to look up to him. And if that wasn't enough, he would eventually go on to kill her friend and co-worker, Sally Hallett, by strangulation, all because she canceled a trip with his mother that ruined his night at home. Some side notes that we know, that we need to know with this, is that there was a pattern, as I said before. Victims were female mostly. smaller in figure, petite, more like dark hair, dark eyes, and they were just beautiful. Most of them were hitchhikers and known as co-eds, hence the co-ed killer. He would use the same method of execution for most of them, if not shooting them and strangling them with his two most, but stabbing them. If he strangled them, he would stab them until they died, and if that wasn't enough, then he would shoot them. And then he would bury them in the backyard, eventually leading officers out there to his backyard so they could see just exactly what he was doing and where these body parts were, not only for their sake, but their families, because they didn't know what happened to these girls. They couldn't have proper burials. Shortly after he was taken in at the age of 15 for his murders towards his grandparents, he was released back into society to have a quote-unquote normal life. But that wasn't possible because he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He might have had a high IQ, but that didn't do much because he was still committing these murders. And at the time, we didn't have the science, the DNA, the evidence to punish or, convict him of these murders. We couldn't convict anybody. Nobody knew who was killing these women and why. He was known as an outgoing guy. He was the one that gave himself up. He had to tell the police, hey, I'm the co-ed killer. They just laughed in his face. They didn't believe him. Nobody did. Because he was so outgoing and so nice, he would help you with anything that you needed. He was a very easy talker and still is to this day, being alive at the age of, I believe, 77 maybe, or 76. Eventually, what led him to being arrested was not only him turning himself in, but showing the police officers the bodies of these women in his yard. With these scenes and investigations, most of them, and I will show you here, involve shooting, stabbing, in this case for Mary, a broken nose and a knife to the back, as well as strangulation, because that wasn't enough. With Anita, it was a knife. With, Alice, it was shooting. With Rosalind, it was shooting at the same time because they were together. With his mother, it was a hammer to the head, decapitation, as most of his victims were decapitated. And also most of their body parts were chopped apart, and a lot of them weren't even found and still haven't been found to this day. But what has been found is what was in his yard that day. With Sally, it was strangulation. He just grabbed her by the neck in the house, immediately broke her neck. What we know is that, as you can see here, the equivocal analysis of the autopsy's findings is with what body parts we had, they were able to conduct an autopsy with what they had, if they had anything. The criminal profiling, the modus operandi for this, his method of approach, as I said before, strangulation, stabbing, shooting, or with his mother, hitting it with her hammer. He would to attack them, he would either shoot them first and that'd be it, or he would strangle them, and if that wasn't enough, he would also finish them off with a knife to the back, and in some cases, like Anita, he would stab her, and then finally, if that wasn't enough, he wanted to strangle her and make sure that she was dead. In this next slide, we see, this is a replica of the .45 automatic that he would use on most of his victims. The knife, there was no picture of that at the time. He never tried to escape, ever. He knew that he couldn't. He was just so large that they would catch him. The factors of this is he was a routine activity kind of guy. He was able to continue his crimes because of his skill level. He would pick up his victims and kill them because he knew the area so well, and he would gain that further knowledge for those future murders. Excuse me. In some ways, you could, destabilize the MO if they had the evidence in the DNA at the time, but they didn't have that. They didn't have that technology. That technology didn't come around until the 80s. There was no X factors in this case. Evidence of staging, he never tried to stage. His personal signature, I say there's none here, but mainly decapitation was what we knew his, signature as. He did suffer from paranoid schizophrenia. He was a full-blown psychopath. And he accomplished all the goals that he wanted and eventually just gave up. The situational and contextual factors, his mother was abusive. He was never normal. Typology was like what I wanted to get to is he was an organized kind of killer. His trademark, again, was decapitating, his signature. He was highly skilled and never got caught, nor did he try to get caught, in a sense. I mean, yeah, there was times where he'd freak out, but he never tried to get caught, and he was so large that he could overpower his victims anytime he wanted. He controlled them. He's able to control them. He, killed out of lust and just the power of being able to do that. And again, his high IQ, all of it. His modus operandi of strangulation, choking, shooting, stabbing, hitting with a hammer. His signature was decapitation, necrophilia, cannibalism, and dismemberment. The outcome of the case is that he pled guilty to all 8 counts of first-degree murder, and he was convicted, sentenced to life in prison, but eventually could not be sentenced to death, because at the time California had put a hold on the death penalty, and he never, ever was executed, and he's still alive to this day. He was moved from San Quentin to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. So this is what we know about Ed Kemp, and he's still alive, and sometimes he is helpful to the law enforcement over there. He helps them figure out potential new serial killers. And you never know. You just need to watch the people that you're around, because like Ed Kemp, no one knew who he was. And no one knew to think of him as the co-ed killer.